of the last 2 years and COVID-19 management, the exchanging of ideas, latest information, but from time to time just checking in to see how one another were doing. He's become a friend, so it was fantastic to catch up in person.
What did you talk about today?
So on the agenda, as you can imagine, we did traverse a little bit over the past 2 years and a little bit projecting forward as to what we expect with COVID into the future. But we also talked about everything from rail infrastructure, some significant projects underway here. We talked about what we're working on back in New Zealand and perhaps the ability to exchange or at least share a bit of the expertise that exists here in Melbourne. We talked about aged care. Dan had just gone and visited a Ryman facility and was very impressed with what he saw there, and of course facilities that we know well in New Zealand and have origin there. We talked about pressures on the health system. We talked about early childhood education because there's some new policies here that mirror a little bit what we're doing at home. We're ultimately politicians interested in ideas, so we shared a number between us.
We had more than 9,500 cases today. The COVID-19 Minister recently reminded us that we're at 10,000 cases when we're in the red light. Is that something you're anticipating will move to soon?
No, we have no expectation at this stage. We've recently done a review and decided to stay in the settings that we have, but keep in mind, we have really important rules at the orange setting that are there to protect us. Having just come from Europe, also recently the United States, even being here in Australia, I can tell you that New Zealand is still using measures many other countries don't. The COVID-19 Minister, again, has also reiterated the two most important things we could be doing right now is mask use and, of course, vaccinations. We're the fourth booster available now, and for those target populations, please, I encourage our older New Zealanders to go out and get that booster shot and for people to keep using their masks. And if you're sick, isolate at home. Not every country is doing that still, and that does set New Zealand apart.
We may still have restrictions. We may still have restrictions, but hospitals are struggling. So is there a case, having 9,500 cases today, to up restrictions?
I think the point here is we have to do things that we know will make a difference to what we're seeing now. And we know that what makes a difference is mask use and vaccinations. Again, these are restrictions that are not widely used outside of New Zealand. We have hung on to them for two reasons. Winter, which we always anticipated, will put pressure on our system, and it is. So please, to help our nurses, our doctors, our health system, keep using masks, stay home if you're sick, and get that fourth dose if you're an older New Zealander in particular.
So it's not 10,000 cases and a hospitals and a health system under pressure. What is it?
I just want to come back to the point. The question here is, would gathering limits right now make a marked difference to the case rates that we have? There is a real question mark over that, particularly given we are seeing those rates in some of our older New Zealanders. We know the biggest thing that we can do to make a difference right now is mask use and vaccines, and so that's what we're asking New Zealanders to do.
ANZ New Zealand Chief Executive Antonia Watson earlier today said that the biggest issue she'd want to sort of talk to you about was New Zealand's immigration settings. She wanted them to be looser because businesses are crying out for labour and labour shortages contributing towards inflation. What's your response to that cry from businesses?
Well, obviously our borders are open. We've been out there encouraging, in particular, in those areas where we know that we have skill shortages, particularly, for instance, hospitality, those tourism operators who are looking to lift and prepare for the number of tourists that we anticipate. There, things like our working holiday visa, actively promoting those and expanding the reach of those schemes to try and support those businesses. In other areas, we've, of course, our accredited employer process now makes it easier for businesses to be able to access the skilled workers that they need. And you'll see that we mark that milestone this week with Minister of Immigration Michael Woods. It's all part of us encouraging those with the skills we need in New Zealand to come in as easily as possible.
Would you consider loosening some of those rules, though?
Can you give me some specifics?
In terms of people who come to New Zealand need to be paid, I think, certain amounts.
So the balance to be struck here is that New Zealand does have skill shortages in particular areas. And so we have made it easier for those individuals to come in and to stay But what we have asked, of course, is that in doing so, that there are particular wage rates, for instance, and conditions we expect, but in often cases, those individuals are in such high demand that is really a barrier.
The government reset its immigration policy, I think it was earlier this year. Is there any scope to soften that? I think Antonia Watson made the point today that moving to a more sustainable model will take time, if not years. So we're moving too fast here.
I would push back on that, because what I would say is where we have identified those areas where there are skills shortages and where there is a lot of demand from New Zealand businesses, but for instance, they may be jobs that have tended to have lower wages. There we have put in place a transition, particularly, for instance, a good example is hospitality. So we've recognised that issue, we've put a longer lead time for that sector in recognition of the issues they're facing.
So you don't agree that our immigration needs to be more flexible? That was the word that
I think the point that I'm making is that we have worked very hard to identify the skills gap New Zealanders have, the issues that businesses are facing, and actually to ease the path for those businesses to bring in those skills that we need. So we've made significant changes to do that. At the same time, in other areas that perhaps might not be areas where we're seeking those higher levels of skills, where it might be in industries that traditionally have had lower wages, we're trying to maintain the wages and standards we have in New Zealand, because otherwise we unfortunately do see wages decrease potentially as a result.
Just back on health quickly. I mean, the Health NZ and the surgeons have lent their voice to support basically getting nurses on the green list. Will you reconsider getting them on the green list before September?
I think the most important point here to make is that there is a change. A change has been made, and that it changes that now, unlike before, New Zealand, if you come into but previously there was no automatic residency for nurses. We've changed that, so now if you're a nurse and you come to New Zealand, you can become a resident. All that we ask is that you bond to the health system for 2 years. So what people are asking is remove the bond. In our mind, if we tell people you can come in but you don't have to be a nurse, that doesn't necessarily solve our nursing shortages.
Is there any evidence that that happened?
There has been. It was raised with us at the time that the list was constructed, and so that's why we asked people to come in and be a nurse for 2 years.
Are you worried with Anthony Albanese's policy about boosting nursing numbers in Australia? They've got to come from
It's a global problem, and I think this is the issue globally. There is a shortage of nurses and high demand for nurses, and so we know that what we have to do is make sure that within New Zealand, and we've had work to do on this, we've been increasing the wages. So since 2017, a 20% increase for some of our nurses, also making sure that we're trying to staff to safe standards. That requires us to hire more nurses too. So we have increased the nursing numbers in New Zealand. We just want to increase them further.
You're off to Sydney tomorrow, your last stop before going back to New Zealand. How are you feeling?
About Sydney, or just generally as a human? As a human. Oh, it has been a very, very busy trip, but that's for good reason. This trip is part of our reconnecting work. Is a singular focus on making sure that we're driving trade, investment opportunities and tourism opportunities for New Zealanders. And I feel very keenly an obligation to make sure that every hour that I'm not in New Zealand, I'm making the most of my time away to promote New Zealand's interests. Yeah.
Further to the
last question.
Thank you. The free trade agreement with Europe.
Yep.
How significant is it that Manuka honey is that we get to sort of keep that name for that product?
Actually, there's a range of areas where I know there's been some focus on the issue of geographic indicators from the EU's perspective, but actually there's benefit for us in being able to ensure that there is some protection around terms that we use in New Zealand. So that also includes for wine from New Zealand regions that are of note as well. And so this does give us protection into the future, and I think New Zealand needs to take some pride in the fact that we now have brands and areas in our country where we're producing products that are in demand, and it's time to start protecting that. Thanks, everyone.
Kia kura.